Go that way. It's done. It's done. Hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
And if we can get some words from the cat as well, that'll be quite important, I think.
Get rid of the cat.
No, I said if we can have some words from the cat.
Oh, the words. Okay, right.
Yes.
Hello, welcome to Sketch Notes on a Pandemic. I'm Lucy Johnston, Health and Social Affairs Editor of the Sunday Express. I'm delighted to welcome today one of our foremost experts in infectious disease, multi-award-winning Oxford professor, Sunetra Gupta. So welcome. So, Professor Gupta, can we first talk about a little bit about what you do?
So the way I got into infectious diseases was actually through ecology. And the way I got into studying the ecology and evolution of infectious diseases was through a love of mathematics and physics. So originally I wanted to study physics, but then I realized that you could apply mathematical models to biological systems, to understand biological systems. And that's what drew me to the field of theoretical ecology. And the study of infectious disease actually falls within that, because infectious disease is actually a product of an ecological interaction between two species, the pathogen and the host, as we call it. In other words, us.
Just one thing I was interested to ask you about your journey into science. It was perhaps harder, was it, at the time that you started to work in this area for women? I just want to know a little bit about your journey and where you sort of came from with that.
Well, my journey was made much easier by growing up mainly in India and in a household and a culture where women were less discriminated against than they currently are within this culture. So both my parents were completely, almost to a fault, sort of gender blind. They said, really doesn't matter whether you're a girl or a boy. And I was just telling someone yesterday how when I was 3 years old, I remember I had a toy ark and I fixed it, sort of got bent out of shape, and I managed to fix it, showed it to my mother. So this is 1968. And she said, "Oh, how wonderful. Maybe you'll be an engineer when you grow up." And I think, you don't hear many women telling their 3-year-old daughters they might be an engineer when they grow up. And yet my mother, who was a Bengali woman in her 20s in 1968, that was the first thing she thought. So I had the benefit of growing up in a culture where I never imagined that being a woman would impede me in any way. The other reasons, of course, are that in India or in Calcutta, looking after children is never just the mother's responsibility. So, and that's partly, of course, because they're nannies and servants as well as extended family. So the idea that one had to choose between motherhood and a career, those are all sort of alien concepts to me.
Did you sort of come into a slight culture shock when you moved here, and when and why did you move here?
Well, so I went to university in America. I went to Princeton, which is on the East Coast. And yes, that was a massive culture shock in a direction that people don't normally expect, in that I was shocked at how insular women were being sort of objectified. And I simply had no idea that educated men could, and educated women for that matter, could think of themselves in that way.
And did you feel the same in the UK when you came here? It was University of London, was it, where you?
So I came to a PhD at the University of London. Less so. I mean, first of all, of course, I was in an atmosphere, with graduate students and uh, within academia, at least the field that I'm in. I would say there isn't. I mean, there's less of an overt sense of women being inferior. And as my experience, I think, evidences over the last year or so, but actually much longer than that, it's not a problem to be a woman in my field. The problem is if you don't agree with the mainstream views.
AIDS and Zika and all the pandemics you've been very heavily involved with.
So AIDS, of course, did come across from non-human primates, as we call them. And I work a lot on influenza at the moment, which is very much a disease also of avian, lots of birds and swine, particularly. I mean, influenza, you have horse flu, you've got dog flu, there are lots of flus. But certainly there have been transfers from swine and birds, particularly into humans. So, yes, some of the diseases I work on happen to be also present in other animals. Even malaria, which is another of my big areas. There are certain non-human, certain monkeys, which can actually be infected by some of the human malarias. I have been looking at whether monkeys have, as we do, certain mutations in their blood cells that make them resistant to malaria. So I don't know if you know about sickle cell anemia, and that's something that has increased in frequency in certain parts of the world because it protects you against malaria, death from malaria. Fundamentally, I work on how diversity evolves in both in pathogen populations and also in the hosts in terms of the genes that are selected because they give resistance to death from these diseases.
So that sort of brings us on to COVID-19. Is this the usual way in which we would deal with a pandemic? And if not, why has it not been dealt with? I mean, in the context of all the other pathogens, I know they're all different.
They are different, and yet there are lots of sort of common themes, even among, pathogens as different as malaria and COVID. And a lot of my insights or hypotheses concerning COVID actually derive from my studies on malaria. So, for example, I'll tell you one very crucial thing that people need to appreciate is that immunity to disease is very different from immunity to infection. So, and that was something I realized when I started working on malaria 30 years ago.
What do you exactly mean by that? I think I understand. So what you're saying is that it's about symptoms and about how the symptoms manifest. Is that what you mean?
So no, what I mean is you can get infected without being ill. So in a typical sort of malarious African village, until recently, if you did a survey for how many people had parasites in their blood, and you took a 5-year-old child, for example, 90% of the 5-year-olds would actually have parasites in their blood, but they wouldn't be ill necessarily.
So that brings me straight on to coronavirus with our mass testing. I think we're doing about 1 million tests a day. A lot of people, and you probably know a lot of people who have it and they are asymptomatic. Does this mean that we should be worrying about these people? I just want to sort of talk about the management of it.
That's precisely the point. So what happens? I mean, I'm sorry to keep talking about malaria, but the similarities are quite striking. With malaria, the first time you get malaria, you are at risk of getting severely ill and dying, and that's why, between 500,000 children die of malaria every year. But malaria is a disease. I mean, deaths from malaria only occur in children because once you've had that first infection, you're very unlikely to die from malaria. You might still get ill. You might get what we call mild malaria, but you're very unlikely to die from malaria. And the same holds for coronavirus, particularly judging if you look at the other seasonal coronaviruses. It's very likely that the first infection gives you a lot of protection against severe disease and death. That's why we don't see many people dying of the other seasonal coronaviruses. And it's very likely that's true also for this so-called novel coronavirus.
Is it a novel virus? I mean, why did we have to react in the way we did and sort of, in a sense, panic in the way we did? Because we had a naive, our population was naive, our immunity was naive to it. It could have been devastating, presumably. Or do you think that there was some immunity from previous coronaviruses, or maybe we never know?
No, we do. I mean, in fact, results from my own lab show very clearly that we have very strong cross-reactivity with other coronaviruses, particularly among the other coronaviruses. There are two families, alpha and beta, and the beta coronaviruses are very similar in many respects with this new virus. It is a new virus, which is why people are dying, because those who are vulnerable, if they had encountered this virus before they became vulnerable, wouldn't be at risk of death. But because it is new and they're meeting it for the first time, they are at risk of death. But the rest of us enjoy a lot of protection, and it's very likely, I mean, there are several studies now, very elegant laboratory studies, showing that you can fight it off through these cross-reactive responses, some of which involve antibodies, but there are also other subsets of the other compartments of the immune system, such as the T cells, which also help fight off coronavirus. So
why are these people vulnerable? So we've got people who we perhaps will never know, but people who are older are vulnerable, and people with identifying underlying conditions, including obesity and diabetes and heart. Do we know why that, and can we draw a line down the middle of the population and say, well, we have to protect, can we do that? Saying,
yes, I think it's very clear who's vulnerable, because particularly, I mean, it was clear already last year when it arrived, because of course it had already rampaged through parts of the world. I mean, already had that data, but now that it's spread so much more widely, it's absolutely clear that people who die who are vulnerable are those who are very much in late stages of their life, at which point you undergo something called immune senescence. In other words, your immune system can no longer cope with things you used to previously deal with perfectly well. So, and that's true for all viruses, which is why flu kills so many people, elderly people as well. Yes. With regard to, and then that's why there's such a high average age of death in countries where the bulk, there are many elderly people. With regard to other comorbidities, that is more complex and has to do with how well you deal with some of the clinical, some of the symptoms, such as pneumonia. So I think it's harder to deal with pneumonia if you are obese. But what actually kills you is always it's a complex phenomenon, And I'm not a medic, so I wouldn't even dare to
We
venture
know
to answer
from
those.
the
But we do know from the data that obesity and diabetes are very serious
yeah.
heart disease as well. So
Why do you think that? I mean, we've never treated a pandemic in this way. We've never used sort of coercion and criminalization and force and fear-based messaging. We've had pandemics before. Do you think there's anything specifically different about coronavirus or COVID-19 that meant we had to behave in this way or react in this way?
absolutely not, which is why, I sort of joined the debate. I tried to join it simply at a scientific level, but my main motivation was the apprehension that these measures that were being adopted would cause enormous harm. I woke up in March last year. I didn't believe for a very long time that this could happen. And, when my daughter
You mean that we
started
do a
telling me,
lockdown? You mean
yeah, lockdown, absolutely. We're going into lockdown. I said, no, that's just not possible. It won't happen in this country. And then when it happened, it was, well, first of all, my first thought was, how can this be happening? And my first thought was about, a little child locked away now in a small inner city flat who's perhaps with a dysfunctional family, or even if not, for whom school is their lifeline. That's where they get fed, they get monitored and socialized. So I just thought this is just too cruel. It was heartbreaking to think of a child in that position.
Well, we know delivery drivers would had to be trained to spot abuse when there was a drop in referrals, wasn't there, to social services during one of the lockdowns?
Absolutely. I mean, everything.
Delivery drivers, spotting after they'd seen
everything. Yeah, all of these things that I anticipated were.
Yes.
Many people anticipated, not just one. Sadly, we were not wrong about it.
No.
But then, of course, also my thoughts strayed immediately back to my own country. Well, I suppose I live in the UK now. What is my own country? But my motherland. In India, I mean, the idea of lockdown just filled me with horror. I mean, what were these? And indeed, within a week, we could see in the news that migrant workers were, being forced to return to their homes, walk home because they had no other means.
Yeah.
And there was one report of a 90-year-old woman who was walking back through the heat because she could no longer sell toys on the pavements of Delhi. I'm sure goes without saying, she probably didn't make it.
I remember. Yeah. I think
and
cruel, yeah.
And the idea of people being locked up in townships in South Africa, I mean, or shanties, people losing the very small means that they have to keep themselves and their children alive, just absolutely broke my heart.
Yes. So, I mean, it's as we need a societal response to a societal problem. And the response we've had has been quite, would you say, single-minded, like focusing on the R number and the infection rather than all the other problems. Is that what you're...
I mean, there's so many layers to this. First of all, as you say, the focus on a single, just coronavirus itself, is unjustified. One should always do cost-benefit analysis at any stage.
It's been argued that there was no time and that we were facing 500,000 deaths and we didn't have time to do a cost-benefit analysis, which is difficult to do.
I don't think it's that difficult to do a very rough and ready cost-benefit analysis, even at that stage. But I agree with you, or with that sentiment, that actually last year in March, one could certainly forgive the government for saying, let's go into lockdown for a few weeks and just get our just regroup and think about this problem, and just for the moment, just stay at home, and let's see what we can do. Let's make a proper assessment of it. That is certainly something I would never dare to question. I'm not making those decisions. I don't have, so I wouldn't presume to question that. I don't think there's much to be gained by arguing over that. But obviously it didn't stop there. And that is really unforgivable, I think. But that's just one issue, which is that you're focusing on a single, I mean, that is the main issue, of course, but then even if you were trying to deal with the problem of coronavirus and minimize deaths, I believe the way that we've gone about it has not achieved that. The models that people rely on are simply hypotheses. They are not predictions. They've been treated as predictions, but they are not predictions. They are simply hypotheses. That's what models do. They generate plausible scenarios, and then you can attach, once the data come in, you can start to decide which is more plausible.
Do you think we haven't done that? Do you think, I mean, in the absence of real world?
Well, I have. I don't know if that's...
In the absence of real world data about, what's going to happen next, we can't really predict what's going to happen. Is there a danger there? Do you think that we haven't?
No, we don't need to predict what's going to happen if we can come up with a policy, predict in the sense of exactly how many what the numbers are going to be. That's not relevant if we have a policy in place, if we have a thorough understanding of the biological mechanisms of infection and disease. We can come up with policies that do not depend upon predictions. And that's what several scientists, including myself, did last summer. So last summer, what we were seeing was that cases were low, certainly in the UK. And you could, generally speaking, the patterns that we've observed across various countries are ones of the disease, of the epidemic, could be explained either by the accumulation of immunity and seasonality alone, or by solely on the basis of interventions. Now, obviously, the truth lies somewhere in between. I think it lies much closer to the natural immunity and seasonality explanation.
How can we know?
How can you know? The only way you know is through experiment and data. And so what we've seen now, by way of some of these experiments have been conducted naturally. And the first experiment that people talked about a lot was Sweden versus the rest of Europe, more or less. And what that experiment has yielded so far is what we have forced to acknowledge as a result of that experiment is that mandated interventions do not perform any better than non-mandated interventions.
People say that in Britain, people wouldn't have obeyed like Swedish people do, and Swedes are much more compliant and they believe in their trust in their governments more. And they say that we needed to mandate.
Well, that's rather insulting to the British people, but I think that, so I'm just saying that that's what a conclusion you can draw. The next layer is this the right kind of intervention in the first place? And
what else?
So then you look at alternatives such as what we suggested, which was to shield the vulnerable, but not lock down the rest of society.
How?
And places that have done that, like Florida in the US, again, have better outcomes, really, than a comparable state like California, which followed this sort of mandated lockdown harsh lockdown type strategies. So
you were involved in Florida. I mean, the governor there, Ron DeSantis, spoke to you over a number of times, or at least was in contact with you and some colleagues that you work with. And he had, whether you call it humility, to sort of change course, didn't he? And the numbers there look, I mean, there was a big warning, wasn't there? I think Biden said, this is Neanderthal for you to drop restrictions, drop masking. It's going to be, people were warning that there was going to be a lot of deaths. What actually happened?
Well, that didn't happen. And what really astonishes me and has completely flabbergasted me throughout this pandemic is the absolute certainty with which scientists and politicians insist that certain things work, like mask mandates, even though if you look at the data, I think it's absolutely clear now that mask mandates make no difference.
So when you say mask mandates, no difference, you're distinguishing that between lab-based studies which show, and I was listening to a scientist yesterday, in fact, on the radio saying, we know masks work. We've seen that it can reduce viral particles by this amount or that amount. And there is quite a bit of data out there. And what you're saying is the mandating of masks across community setting doesn't make any difference because there is evidence for that. I mean,
that's what we have the evidence for. In terms of do they work at a mechanistic level, I think it would be naive to assume just because there might be a reduction. I mean, it goes without saying, if you sneeze without a mask or with a mask, there'll be more viral particles in the air. But most people aren't sneezing. Most people aren't walking around shedding huge amounts of virus. So, and the other thing that is missing from this reasoning is what the relationship is between how much virus is leaking out or how people actually do get infected. I mean, what you see among mask wearers, for example, in the supermarket, you're wearing a mask, but then you touch every single thing.
And then it goes in the pocket and on the dashboard. And I mean,
there's just touch screens. I find that really peculiar because I'm a bit squeamish myself, so I don't like touch screens. I remember going to the surgery when they installed them in my surgery saying, what are you doing installing touch screens? I don't want to come in and touch a screen that someone, with pneumonia has just been.
There's a big debate about the scientists. I don't know whether they're even talking to each other enough, but there is some certainty around the fact that this is aerosol. The transmission is aerosol and not much else. I mean, perhaps we don't even know that. There's a lot of mysteries around it. And as you say, yeah.
I think that it's very, very difficult to say anything with that level of certainty. So what we should be looking for, what are the things we do know? What are we certain about? We've already talked about the who's vulnerable and who isn't. That's something I think we have enough data that we can be quite certain, not completely certain. I mean, there will be some people with occult hidden comorbidities who will might not know that they're vulnerable.
That could be the same with any virus, and that's
true. Yeah,
I mean, the infection fatality rate now post-vaccine is about similar to other seasonal respiratory viruses. Are we about that?
Well, yeah, the post. I mean, vaccine or natural infection we would have been led to the point. I feel quite, or I won't say certain. It's very, very likely. It's more likely than anything else, any other scenario, that this virus would have settled down to a state similar to the other seasonal coronaviruses.
So, and the reason done nothing. I mean, I read somewhere that most pandemics take about 18 months to 2 years to sort of wash through a population. Had we done nothing, have we any idea where we'd be now? We certainly would have a better economy. We'd have children that were better educated, less depressed, and all the other harms that have gone with it. But I mean, had we done nothing but focus protection, as you said, we'd perhaps be in a better place.
if we'd actually properly put in place focus protection, we would have been in a far better place, is my view.
And what does focus protection involve?
So focus protection would have meant that we asked those who were vulnerable, who perceived themselves to be vulnerable, as to stay, to protect themselves by adopting the measures that everyone was asked to adopt anyway. In other words, sheltering at home. We'd have had to have put in the effort to protect the care homes and prevent hospital spread. Those, obviously, we know now are the two areas that we really should have given more attention to.
That's been our big problem. I think a third of deaths have been in care homes, and hospital-acquired infections, I think up to half of infections in hospital were hospital-acquired. So that's been the biggest problem.
Exactly. So that was the biggest problem. Now, but that goes without saying, and everyone agrees that should have been a focus of our attention. But in the community, the way to stop spread was to ask those who are vulnerable to do what we all did, which was stay at home, put in place the measures that would, allow them to do that. So, make sure they could get their groceries delivered in a sensible way. I mean, in not again, you'd have to have proper infection control. So, so that would be the biggest part of preventing community acquisition. And instead we did the opposite. We allowed vulnerable people during lockdown to go out and get infected because they're essential workers and they could not afford to stay at home like many of us could. So we did the opposite. And then, one objection to this that came up then was that what about multi-generational families? And what we would have had to have done with multi-generational families, the percentage of people we're talking about here is quite low. I believe it's not more than 3%. I may be wrong, but whatever that percentage is we would have had to essentially have evacuated the vulnerable, the elderly. We would have had to put them in a nice hotel in the country or something. With the amount of money that we've spent on test, track, and trace, we could have done anything, right? And this was treated with great horror by some people when they said, "Oh, you're proposing that elderly people should be moved out of their own homes." Evacuation is something we do. That's what we did with children during the war. You do, in crises, you do evacuate people, and it would be over a short period of time, because without lockdowns, this washing through process that you described would have occurred on a much shorter time scale. Now, that's where we were in October in terms of sort of recommending what to do. But now, of course, we have a vaccine. So fortunately, we don't even need to continue that debate, at least with respect to coronavirus. Or maybe we do now, because people are getting so worried about whether doubly vaccinated people are actually fully protected, that we are starting to see, the kind of panic that accompanies a rise in infections, sort of starting to bubble up again.
Do we need to?
And actually, what we should do is, if it is true, and this is something I wanted to get, what does the vaccine actually offer? The vaccine offers protection against severe disease and death. That's what it does. Just as I was saying before about how your first infection in malaria and possibly flu gives you protection against disease, severe disease and death. That's what young people didn't have in 1918, and that's why they died, dropped like flies during that pandemic. So what the vaccine gives you protection against severe disease and death, But the protection that it offers against infection is incomplete and likely to be transient, because natural infection with other coronaviruses also does the same thing. So this is very important. It gives you protection against severe disease and death permanently. So durable protection against severe disease and death.
How do we know it's permanent?
How do we know that? Well, for the other coronaviruses, we know it's permanent because we don't see people dying of them.
Fine.
And yet we know we're infected regularly and reinfected. So what we're looking at is a pathogen where the first infection gives you ample protection and durable protection against severe disease and death until you get to the point where your immune system kind of packs up when you get very old. But it only gives you short, transient protection against infection. So the way herd immunity or immunity in the population is maintained is by reinfection. But the reinfection process does not carry with it a very high risk of, it's often asymptomatic. You might get a bit of a sniffle.
So our obsession with testing, and I mean, my children have been sent home from school for the 3 weeks till next September. This obsession with testing and checking, is this keeping us in a sort of self-perpetuating purgatory? I mean, is there a problem with younger people now becoming infected? I mean, there's
absolutely not.
Well, that's it. So there's a lot of talk, and there's 1,000 scientists have signed a letter just recently about this unethical experiment of letting the virus rip, which in a sense was, the way the vaccines are allowing us to, shield vulnerable people and protect those. But they talk about long COVID and how we don't know what letting the virus rip through the younger population will do. Would you argue with that?
Very strongly, because a lot of young people have been already infected worldwide with COVID. A lot of children, millions of children have been infected with COVID. They're not dying of long COVID. They're dying of starvation. The measures because of the measures that have been taken to suppress infection.
There are figures on children and long COVID which are debated. I think any symptom after coronavirus is counted in some studies, and in other studies, there are sort of disputes about what it actually means, and whether we're confusing it with depression in children. And what's your take on long COVID? Because that's one of the very strong arguments.
I don't see any compelling evidence that children are suffering from long COVID. I see very strong evidence that children are suffering in many other ways. They're being deprived of education. They're being muzzled, masked. They're being subject to atmospheres that could scar them for life. They're being the inequalities, the opportunities that should be offered to them, which we don't offer enough of to particularly deprived children. We've taken away completely. I mean, what we've done to children is, for me, just beyond belief. Those are the things that I can see happening. I'm seeing a fall in vaccination rates against, preventable diseases that actually kill children, like measles, dropping around the world. These are the things I can see. I don't see any evidence of long COVID. I don't also understand why, obviously it's possible, everything is possible, but I don't understand what the clinical basis would be for all these children to suddenly get long COVID from a coronavirus infection when they are regularly subject to coronavirus infections. and we don't see them getting long COVID. So why would this particular virus suddenly give children long COVID?
Well,
I don't understand the basis of that, and I don't see how the harms stack up in any way compared to the obvious harms of all these measures that are being taken to stop them spreading.
And what about, I mean, there are a lot of adults who've been reporting with long COVID, and should we be using, or should children be prevented from getting infection so that they don't infect adults, particularly vulnerable adults who may be immunocompromised or, maybe still vulnerable to COVID?
Well, I don't think so under any circumstances. I don't think children, I think children come first. Children, that's my paramount concern. So, for example, I've always felt, I mean, I was strongly in favor of having in-person teaching because I felt that it would be unethical for me to not do that, to deprive my students of that experience based on the very small risk I actually have of dying of COVID. So that's unethical, but it's also not something we do with any other infection. I could also die of flu tomorrow that I might catch from my student or my daughters or whatever. It's for me fundamentally unethical to subject young people and particularly children to harm just to protect themselves.
People say this isn't flu, and they get very upset if you compare it to flu because they say it's that much more deadly and that much more unknown, and it's experimental to behave in a way. And you would argue?
No, I would argue it's in its endemic state. It's very likely to be like any of the other coronaviruses, at which point it is far less deadly than flu. Obviously, in its epidemic state, it was a problem. I mean, there's no question that it was a very serious problem. I mean, I've lost some very dear cousins to this virus. I'm very upset that it's happened, and it's something I wish could have been prevented. I mean, not just deaths of my own in my own family, but all these coronavirus deaths could have been prevented if we'd been able to implement focused protection policy, or indeed if we had rolled out the vaccine, given the vaccines to the vulnerable earlier. So I feel, I can't actually even describe how I feel about the fact that I have been jabbed twice, and my 72-year-old cousin in Calcutta died of coronavirus because that was just recently. So
you're saying you didn't need to have that vaccine; she could have had it.
She could have had that vaccine, and she would have been alive today.
So in that sense, well, I mean, I'll just sort of confirm that the infection fatality rate for COVID-19 now, because we have protected vulnerable people and because it has gone through our population, is less than influenza. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it would have always settled to a point where it was far less than influenza.
Because it's more less deadly as it becomes as it moves through the population. Is that why?
Okay, so what happens in an epidemic is you get a large number of infections happening all at once. And that's what happened, of course, and continues to happen in pockets where people are not, sufficient numbers of people are not immune. Once sufficient numbers of people are immune, that endemic level of infection drops down to quite a low level. I mean, that infection drops to a low level in an endemic situation.
Yeah.
So it means that vulnerable people, their risk of being infected drops right down once you have herd immunity. And this is why herd immunity is important, because herd immunity protects the vulnerable by causing the risk of infection to drop down. So the risk of infection is very high in an epidemic,
Yeah.
and then it becomes low once enough people have acquired herd immunity. And that is traditionally how we protect vulnerable people. So we don't actually have a good vaccine, for example, against flu, and we don't use vaccines or have them against many other respiratory infections. But we live with the deaths that they cause. And that's because we can't really do any better than maintain this sort of endemic equilibrium. And that's where we would have headed anyway with coronavirus. But of course, that's not what we want to do. I mean, I agree that we needed to protect the vulnerable while we were on this journey to an endemic state.
So we have to, whatever way you cut it, we've got to get to a level of endemic disease or get to a level of herd immunity, however that happens with vaccines or with natural infection. There are a group of people who believe that we can just stop the virus completely and get either zero COVID, as we've seen in New Zealand, or other countries seem to have very low levels, and that would be ideal. That we have, it's called maximum suppression as well. How do you think, that means people have said to me, we could have stadiums open, children could go back to school without having to distance, and we'd be free again?
I think that that is completely unrealistic. I mean, if you just look at this is where mathematical models are very useful. If you look at the two possible states in which we can exist with the virus, indeed, there is what is called the trivial equilibrium, where there is no virus at all. But that state is completely unstable. It's totally unstable. So as we can see in Australia, you keep it out, but it will get in. It will somehow. As soon as one person's infected, it will take off.
I don't believe that if we got a really good track and trace system, which is what I hear a lot, we could just jump on it and like a listeria or E. coli outbreak, just squash it down again and then go back to normal again.
It just spreads too quickly. I mean, it's not something you can block. It's just unrealistic to expect that to happen.
Yeah.
And the costs are enormous. The costs of trying to maintain that, it's just a futile exercise. And people who advocate that clearly aren't taking into account the costs of even trying to get there. I think that several people have abandoned that as a goal.
Yes.
The other state, which is the endemic state, unfortunately cannot be reached through vaccination. And this is a fundamental misconception that needs to be cleared up. Let's take measles as the best example. The measles vaccine gives you permanent immunity against infection, and also, therefore, disease and death, which means you can use the measles vaccine to create herd immunity in the population. But, and in fact, I remember arguing about it 2 years ago with Public Health England, saying what was the reason they couldn't mandate measles vaccines. So the reason I think coronavirus vaccines should not be mandated is not because I'm completely against mandating vaccines. The reason I think it should be mandated is because it cannot achieve the same thing. It cannot give you herd immunity.
Why
and
not?
That's because natural immunity against coronavirus is not one. When you get infected with coronavirus, you acquire immunity to infection, or at least partial immunity to infection, but that is not lifelong. And the vaccine is very unlikely to do better than that. And indeed, we're already starting to see what are called breakthrough infections. So it's very important to distinguish, to have it straight in your head what the vaccine actually can deliver. The vaccine is fantastic at delivering focused protection. It's not very good at creating herd immunity. unless we keep vaccinating people, sort of every year, annually vaccinating people, we're not going to be able to use this vaccine to get herd immunity.
So
I think it's a very bad idea to vaccinate everybody every year.
Why?
Because a much simpler solution would be to allow natural immunity to accumulate in the population, and allow that sort of natural cycle of reinfection that consolidates immunity. That would be better than annually subjecting people to vaccination. Why? Because it's expensive. It's always difficult to vaccinate.
What is wrong with the COVID vaccine that it is so imperfect? Why do we not have is it because of variants, or what is the problem?
The problem is simply that coronavirus itself belongs to a category of SARS-CoV-2 belongs to the coronavirus family, and within the coronavirus family, infection does not give you lifelong immunity against further infection. The ecology of that virus is such that you keep getting reinfected, and that's what tops up population level immunity. But those reinfections are not symptomatic. So that's the simplest way and most robust way of keeping a high level of immunity in the population, which translates as low risk for those who are vulnerable.
And better immunity is natural immunity, more broad spectrum, and perhaps with more longevity.
Probably, I think that would be my guess. But I think the main problem is that the vaccine can't give you lifelong immunity against infection. So even with vaccines that give you lifelong immunity against infection, it is pretty difficult to reduce the numbers of deaths. So measles, until recently was killing 1 million children a year in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, that number was reduced considerably to almost down to 250,000. Who knows where it's going to go back up to.
The idea of vaccinating people who are, say, under 30 and vaccinating children, which there's a huge call for, what do you feel about that, given that?
I think it's completely unnecessary. I think that what we need to do, what we should be doing as global citizens, is using these excellent vaccines to protect the vulnerable around the world.
So you're someone who wanted to mandate measles vaccination for children. You're someone, I believe, who is working on developing a universal flu vaccination. So you're very pro vaccines, the right vaccine, the appropriate place. So you're not anti-vax at all, but you actually don't think that people in a healthy younger population, and I don't know what age you would put, should be vaccinated with the COVID vaccine. Is that what you're saying?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, I don't even, as I said, I feel, embarrassed and actually mortified that a vaccine that could have protected an elderly person in the developing world was put instead into my arm. I mean, I'm at pretty low risk, I think, of dying from COVID. I know I already had COVID, or I think I did.
Well, should we be focusing our efforts instead of booster jabs and vaccines for children and younger groups? Do you believe that we should be putting our vaccines over to places that need them for vulnerable groups instead?
I believe that very strongly. I really do. I think we are doing them a disservice, of course, but also ourselves a disservice. We do not need to jab young people. I'm prepared to accept 50 as a cutoff. I mean, you've got to have some arbitrary cutoff. And therefore, I obviously participated in that, in the hope that would then, reduce the anxieties surrounding this pandemic, or particularly in this country, just that would then allow the government to deliver what it promised, which is that once the vulnerable were protected, that we could open up. I mean, in my opinion, we should have done that before the vaccine using other means, just because the costs of these interventions are so profound. But now we have a vaccine. I don't understand why we feel the need to jab everybody. Well, I do understand that, but it's based on the misconception that the vaccine will deliver herd immunity. What we should be going for is a combination of vaccinating the vulnerable and allowing natural immunity to operate in those who are not vulnerable, to build up a wall of protection.
So would you worry about variants? I mean, we do in this country have these red list countries, and we've seen the Delta, Alpha, Beta variants, and that's been used to explain why we've got a surge in infections now.
I am quite mystified, actually, as to why these surges are being blamed on particular variants. So, because there really isn't, first of all, any way to tell whether it's the variant that causes a surge or whether a variant is selected for within a surge. My own feeling is that it's much more plausible, epidemiologically speaking, that the surges are driven by other factors, such as seasonality or releasing restrictions. And then once there is a surge, you have a race amongst the variants, and the one with even a very slight advantage will win. So I think it's very strange that people are talking about the Delta variant as being much more transmissible and being responsible for the increases in infection that we're seeing. That seems to me.
Why do they say that? How can they justify that? I mean, there has been...
I don't know. There isn't any...
How it could more easily infect people. So therefore, there's a mechanistic explanation. But what you're saying is that environmental explanations can't be...
No, I don't think that there's a mechanistic explanation for how it could be 50% more transmissible. That seems to me to be mechanistically also very unlikely. So I think there's no mechanistic explanation. I mean, it's all implausible. Mechanistically, it's implausible, and ecologically, it's very unlikely. The much more parsimonious explanation, as we call it, is that it has a slight advantage, either because it's a bit more transmissible or because it is able to reinfect people who are already immune to the previous variant. So it has a slight advantage in terms of immune evasion, as we call it.
So but that brings me kind of onto the idea of censorship. There are, and I've spoken to lots of scientists that would agree with that. And I know that when you argued for focus protection as well, those voices get shut down and they get screened out of the debate. And then there's sort of Twitter, which is a boxing match. People who disagree with the prevailing narrative are shut out. So that's happened with variants. So, I mean, presumably you've seen that happen with your own views on that and with other people's, and with the Great Barrington Declaration, which was arguing for focus protection. What happened after that? And what do you think about the censorship that has happened?
I mean, I'm just astonished by it. I really cannot believe that. I would never have believed that our views would be, that our views would be misrepresented in this way, that we'd be accused of being in the pockets of far-right libertarian groups. I mean, it's just... it really just beggars belief. I mean, throughout my career, I have experienced a lot of resistance from scientists, including some of the ones who are resisting these ideas. So, for example, my flu vaccine rests on a model. It was actually a result of a mathematical model to explain the evolution of influenza in a different way to what people believed. And that's when trying to test that hypothesis, we tested it, found it to be correct, and then it was the basis for this new flu vaccine. And that model was published almost 15 years ago now, and it was treated again with it was either ignored or rejected by the majority of scientists in the influenza field. But that was to my advantage, because that meant nobody else pursued it, tried to test it, and nobody else came up with this vaccine, which we've now patented and licensed. The shutting down our voices during this coronavirus pandemic and subjecting us to the kinds of abuse and smear campaigns that, I would just never have imagined. I'd never have imagined that The Guardian would print pieces from respected academics who were accusing us of being, paid by the Koch brothers. I hadn't even heard of the Koch brothers, frankly, at the time that I went to Great Barrington. But I mean, it's just, these people know me. They know that if anything, you'd describe me as a socialist. So they know that I'm left-leaning. So, how they found it, I just don't understand how it was possible for them. I think universities need to take a very strong line here. I think they need to preserve academia as a space where you can have these sorts of discourses. And it's absolutely unbelievable what's happened.
Yes, even I know it's just one tiny element of it, but the idea of a lab leak theory being sort of defined.
Yeah, the way in which it was dismissed is unfortunate. Personally, I think it's much more likely not to be a lab leak. And I also think that gain of function experiments are very valuable. So to shut them down as
gain of function experiments
where you look to see what the virus needs in order to be able to infect humans, for example, or to transmit. I think those are very valuable experiments. Obviously, they have to be done under strictest biosecurity conditions. I think the viruses that are created in that manner are very unlikely to be able to compete against the ones that are naturally circulating.
Bit with the dog was my favourite bit.
Yeah, I think you'd keep the dog.
Yeah. Thank you so much.